afternoon, everyone. It's absolutely fantastic to be back Interchange this year. I think this show has continued to go from strength to strength, and given some of the topics that are particularly relevant in the recent weeks, I think it's a good time to talk about some of the issues, because I think we're all going to have to think slightly differently about how we're thinking about our infrastructure across the whole of the UK and the international side of things. So, as you can see there, last year I came and spoke to colleagues and talked about the criticality of ports, not just from a trade perspective, but also the hinterland, inland, and also our international links out into our international colleagues and international markets around the world. But obviously since then, and it's something we've been thinking about quite carefully for the last 2 years, but given its topic, particularly topical this week, is how we think about military capability in the UK's major ports is something that the major ports think about in ever more detail, almost on a daily basis. And I'll give you, for those who don't know who we are, I'll come on to that in just a second. But I just wanted to perhaps prompt some thought on how you're thinking about this, and perhaps we can have some Q&A at this at the end. But the key is it's not just the port. How we think about dual use, and what I mean by that is military capability, as well as keeping supply chains open and keeping our nation trading, is something that every nation is having to think about now. But it's particularly acute in the UK because of our strategic role, partly as with our own efforts, but also with NATO and our EU colleagues as we move into the next phase. And what really matters here is how we think about resilience, and I'll come on to that. I'll come on to that in my slides. Is that we've all got our own slightly different impression about what we mean by resilience, and I think that's the key how we think about this, because whether it's road or rail or local authority or planning or permitting, this really matters in a dual-use context, because we might need to move troops and goods and move things at a pretty short notice, and that's just as key is that we keep these ports open and ability to trade as well. So, so just a bit on the major ports group. I'm sure you all know who we are, but just in case for those that don't, I'm the chief exec of the UK Major Ports Group, and I represent the 9 large largely privately owned port owning groups in the UK. I won't list them all, but you can imagine Associated British Ports, Peel Ports, and everything else. Also in there, we have the Port of London Authority, which manages the 90 miles of the Thames, which a number of major ports sit alongside, and also the Belfast Harbour, which has significant presence in the city of Belfast, as well as doing all the harbour activity. And between us, we've got about 43, 44 of the UK's major ports. As you can see from here, it's not every port. It's quite a complex infrastructure we have in the UK, but we largely represent the ports that were privatised in the early 90s and have gone on to invest many billions of pounds since then, and we continue to invest over £1 billion a year between these ports. So you'll see there, maybe you know some of them, but as you'll see there, that this 85%, 86% of most of the volume comes through these ports, as well as overall 95% of all the goods that come through in and out of the UK come through the ports of the UK. So you'll see who the owners there are. I won't list them all now, but you'll also see there's a huge international consideration there, with Hutchison Ports owned in Hong Kong. You'll also be aware DP World owned in the UAE, and most of our owners have a significant international stakeholder and shareholder ownership structure. So it's worth just bearing that in mind in terms of the conversation. Just quickly on some of the objectives that we think about and care about, and it's something that's particularly topical at this great show, because so many of these areas are touched on at Interchange, whether it's planning. We call it regulatory drag. This is a real challenge for how we deliver investment at pace. And this is a challenge where, and I often say this, that when projects don't happen, this is the lessons we learn, because it's often something that seems to be quite mundane, where we've had an inability to move at pace to allow our investors to have enough confidence and certainty, and I'll come back to that later, enough certainty to invest. Likewise, port connectivity, and again, think about dual use in that context. We can do most things in our ports, but we need the ability to move things to and from these ports, whether that's containers, whether that's the energy transition, whether it's troops. In all of those contexts is a really important consideration. And also, again, relevant and topical at this particular event is how we secure energy and the power we need to continue to invest in a strategic way. And that's also quite interesting in the context of having our own power, and so looking after our customers, and we're working very closely with National Grid and others in that context. Again, just for context, you'll see broadly where we think about some of the infrastructure that impacts these ports. This is moving at pace. I was delighted to sit down with National Highways and Network Rail this morning and other colleagues to talk about the hinterlands inward looking from the port inland, so our key logistic hubs in the East Midlands, West Midlands, and further up north. For example, in Scotland, London Gateway really matters to the Scottish Government because of that interconnectivity between the different ports and logistics assets. And ultimately, the key here is this is a small island, and this is the bit we need to be really, really mindful of, is that on a small island, we can invest in every way inside the port fence, but we also need to make sure that our connectivity, be it road, rail, power, you name it, is fit for purpose in a 21st century in a fast-growing sector. And if you look at international comparators, I think there's a bit of work to do. You'll see here the impact on where our ports are. Many of our ports are in areas that have had significant deindustrialization over the years, but the ports remain. Often there's the largest private sector employer, and it's worth bearing that in mind as we think about, if you compare it here, and this is courtesy of GeoStrategy, it's a great slide, but if you look at GDP, these areas where largely our port owning groups are the size of medium-sized countries and advanced growing countries. And often the ports are at the key and central points in delivering that further growth. So it's worth bearing that in mind in terms of where we are. And if you think about the complexity of the environment in which we're heading into, not only from a trade perspective, but also how we become a more resilient nation, I think this is one of the most interesting parts we need to think about. And this is not exhaustive. It's really not exhaustive, but I just wanted to show you the sort of level of complexity that we're thinking about. And this is stuff in the water, down in the Celtic Sea, right across on the East Coast here. This is future energy projects, which are actually fundamental to what the ports do next. How we think about this, all the activity inland and the key industrial nodes and everything else like that. But how we think about this in a military context, and I will, encourage you to read some really interesting documents in things like Naval Review. This is a really, really important contribution that we need to think about, is we're going to have to do things differently. We're doing things differently. Local authorities will have to do things differently. Devolved governments are going to have to do things differently. And as will National Highways, Network Rail and others, because in some parts of the country we've got excellent infrastructure outside the port gate. In some others, we've got a lot of work to do. And I think that there will be new challenges that will need to be done at pace now, so we're sort of ready to really kick it on. And the key point in all of this is between industry, and I represent industry, and government, and I mean that in all shapes and sizes of government. I worked in government for a long time and sort of reflect on the amazing work that many parts of government do that's unrecognized and unseen. But we need to make sure that we're talking the same language. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about dual use, if I ask most of you in this audience what do you mean by dual use, we would probably all have a slightly different interpretation of what we mean by that. Likewise, on foundational, you'll have seen in the industrial strategy, in the 2025 industrial strategy, that the ports were described but not defined as foundational. We need to understand what that actually means in a practical sense, and that's some of the work we're doing with colleagues across government in DBT, in DFT, with highways, in Network Rail. Likewise, on international gateways. And the key point there is international. It's not national, critical national infrastructure, but critical international infrastructure. We are in the middle of what is a very, very complex journey, whether that's a container, whether that's whether that's aggregates or raw materials, or whether it's military movements. We are at the absolute centre of journey either side of that in terms of what's coming into the UK, as well as then moving around the rest of the point. Again, quickly on mutual definition, we need to understand what resilience means. We also need to understand what we mean by strategic base. If I just go back to that slide there, some people would look at that and say that's a very straightforward and very clear strategic base. Others will have a different view on that. And that's the bit that we've got to do collectively in a joint effort over the next period. So I put this image in because I think it captures quite neatly what we're contending with at the major ports, is that our job and our efforts are to keep trade flowing, but also to do our bit to protect the realm. And that's the key point here, is in a new age of geopolitical activity and a new age of geoeconomic activity, we're going to have to think about things in a different way. And you'll see there, that's the board of the Major Ports Group, as you'll see there. And we've come to a very, very clear and practical arrangement with the Ministry of Defence and UK Government to commit to our ports being made available for military capability in whatever shape or form, and we're working very closely on that. And the other bit I'm keen to sort of impress upon here, this is not just a UK issue. NATO colleagues, our international colleagues, And we're working closely with our European colleagues across the way. The EU Commission has just published its new port strategy today. I would encourage you to read that because that's talking about resilience and how we make sure that the EU ports that we work closely with are supporting this effort too. And I think this is where it becomes very interesting. So, not only are we doing that, we're thinking carefully about the energy transition, and be it carbon capture, be it offshore wind, be it floating offshore wind, be it new ways of generating, storing and producing power on the port estate. This is going to be a really, really interesting area for us going forward. And I think the bit that's worth thinking about is the way we invest and the way there's potential public investment in all this is potentially stacking opportunities, and that there may be some military investment, private investment, energy investment that could combine to allow supportive projects to go forward in a different way. And I think the other point, and I did say this last year, but it's worth repeating, that historically, since the ports were privatised in the early 90s, our ports have been slightly treated as a sort of economic islands, slightly abstract thing at the end of the line. Whereas given what's coming forward and what we've been doing over the last 5 or 10 years, we've got to put freight and logistics, actually, not just ports, but freight and logistics at the centre of economic development and at the centre of how we protect the nation. And again, international gateways is interesting. If I point to London Gateway, which is a brand new port in the grand scheme of things, it's 15 years old, 14 years old, been operational, grew at 52% last year. 52% in 1 year, and has grown in an incredible amount in the last 10 years. DP World have invested over $4 billion in here, private capital, $4 billion, and now on to berth 6 and 7, having done the first 4, and they will continue to grow inherently at an absolute pace. What we haven't seen is the public infrastructure grow in the same way and move as quickly. So the road and rail infrastructure around London Gateway is basically the same as when it was an old, disused Shell facility, which I think we've got to be better at that, and that's a challenge for us, and that's, I think, something for us all to think about. And how we do that is a critical part of what comes next, really. So that's why, again, why we're trying to unlock much more money in terms of private capital, but this is stuff outside the port fence. So we make our ports absolutely as efficient as possible, and we continue to invest well over £1 billion a year in terms of that. But we've got to get the investment outside the port fence as well. And again, just to give some context, and this is not scientific, we roughly think that public investment is about 20 years behind private investment in the UK. Our ports are largely privately owned in the UK. It's different in different parts of the world, but the public investment is about 20 years behind. And what that means is road capacity, rail capacity, significant infrastructure investment has not kept pace with what the private investment has done in those ports. So it's worth thinking about that, because we may get to the perfect alignment on this. We won't. It takes time. But I think it's worth thinking about not just what our ports do to keep the shelves stocked and what our ports do to keep the country operating, is how we think about our ports in a new way, and how we're all going to have to think about our infrastructure, our international gateways, be it airports or ports, in a new way, because these are pieces of critical international infrastructure, not just the usual CNI, and this is where we are. So again, it's worth thinking about how we think about our language. What do we mean by long term? What do we mean by resilience? What do we mean by dual use? We've got our own views on this, but for everyone involved in the public realm and everyone involved in various sectors that work closely with these critical pieces of assets in the UK, and this is just the same challenge in many other parts of the world, by the way, is that we've got to work much closer and be using the same sort of definition about what we mean. So I think it's worth taking that away. So I'll pause it there. You have my email, I think, on the slide there. This is a really critical time. I didn't expect it to be as topical this week when I agreed to do this presentation a couple of months ago with Paul, but given what's happening in the world, we are seeing significant change. And we're ready, but we also need to make sure that all of our partners, be it in the public sector or the private sector, are ready as well. So I'll park it there, and I look forward to having a chat with Nigel.
Come and sit down.
Thank you.
Thank you. We don't often have the opportunity to get these insights, so you should take the most of it. Are there any questions from the floor? And if there are going to be, that's good to know. I'll send over the microphone in a second. In fact, we'll start with your question.
Hi there. Really enjoyed the presentation. My question's about the energy transition. So last year I read the Immingham Port cancelled the green ammonia project. with Air Products. I think it was £2 billion to process green ammonia for the UK use. So what's your company's role in the energy transition when it comes to utilising the ports for hydrogen, green ammonia and green methanol?
Great question. There is no one more ambitious and keen to see these projects happen than me and my board. The challenge we have is ultimately we need to have enough certainty and surety that we can make long-term investment. I said during my discussion, when we talk about long-term, we're in the business of 20, 25 years. 15, pick your number. But we're not. What we can't do is invest for something that might be a 3-year, 5-year scheme. We need that absolute certainty that we can make that investment on a long-term basis, and that's not directly relevant to that particular scheme. But it's a general point on the energy transition: is that there's a wall of private capital awaiting to fund energy transition projects in and around our ports. But what we don't have is enough certainty. Maybe it's from government in some areas, but we also need just enough confidence to say that if we make billions of pounds of investment, we can see a return on that. So I think on some of these projects, there's a nascent challenge, is that how you make it commercial and scalable. But for those that we think are commercial and scalable, it's having enough. And I sort of go back to the point I made earlier, really, is that when we're all talking about everyone's got to have enough certainty, you've got to have enough certainty, I have, and then we can get it done. But I think that's the bit we've just got to work a little bit harder on to make these projects happen. And I think I said this last year, but there's probably never been a more exciting time to be part of the port sector. And the reason is because of the energy transition, because of the wall of capital that I see that wants to come into the UK and invest. And you'll have seen in the news since we last met, we've seen some changes in ownership, and we'll continue to see that in the next period. But for all of us, certainty has to be defined, and we've all got to have enough certainty to be able to press the green button, because we're in the business of pressing the green button.
Oh. Sorry, did you have a follow-up? Go ahead. For sure.
I think there's a question.
Over here. Over here. Over here.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. Andreas Carey Bailey, Mace Consult. I'm the Ports and Maritime Sector Lead, so really hit a note with me, and I'm also supporting ABP on Solent Gateway 2 at the moment.
Yep.
We were privileged enough to do a tour of Marchwood Military Port last week, so really interesting to understand.
Quite something, isn't it? It's quite something.
It's
really
fundamentally nationally significant, and roots back to D-Day landing and supporting the resilience in the UK economy. Really a barometer of the UK economy. I think the question is, how do we reduce that regulatory drag that you mentioned and really safeguard the private funding investment to get these major projects off the ground?
Well, it's a great question, and something we've put a huge amount of effort and resource into actually in the last 2 or 3 years. I'll give you a very quick example. So, on regulatory drag, there's a very specific phrase there that we use, right? This is not about getting rid of regulation. This is about getting rid of regulation we either don't need, that is not fit for purpose, hasn't been touched since 1962, and I'm slightly exaggerating the point to make the point, but there is a swathe of regulation that we don't need that is a blocker on growth. And if you think about the conversation we have with our investment committees, it's very rarely about the scheme itself. It's about, well, when can we get planning? Have we got the right connectivity? Have we got the right regulation? Can we get the right permitting and licensing? And too often those questions are, it takes longer than we hope, or we haven't got an answer. So let me give you a very quick example, is that with the MMO, which is the Marine Management Organisation, which you'll be aware of, but for others watching today, we went into a very clear sandbox arrangement with the MMO. So, and this is where we can be better. So we've gone into, all of the major port groups have gone into an arrangement, a sandbox arrangement with the MMO, and we've now at the point of publishing 23 very clear recommendations where we can do away with regulatory drag, we can be better, they can be better, and we're moving to a phase now where that relationship is dramatically changed in the last 2 years. And we're working closely with the Environment Agency and Natural England and lots of devolved bodies across the UK. And I think it's a case of we can all be better, and that's what I'm committed to.
Sorry, sir. Oh.
Hello. Thank you. You obviously talk about the billions are being invested by port owners, rightly so, and obviously more to be invested because they can see a return. So the question might be, why don't they invest £1 billion and build their own road infrastructure?
Well, Philip, I know you're very canny on this, but it's a good question. But ultimately, what we need to get to, and I've been in these conversations, is that there's often a few conversations around private sector investment into a road or rail scheme, but what we haven't got is time frame, actual cost, who owns it, what happens if it goes wrong, what happens in year 101, after 100 years, who owns it, who decommissions, what happens to all the maintenance and renewals. And I know you're very up to speed on these things, Philip. But I think the other fundamental, of course, is that we have quite a sophisticated EBITDA model and return on capital investment for our port assets. You have to be quite careful that if you then start adding external things into that asset, all of a sudden your EBITDA is a bit different and your return on capital is potentially a bit different. So you have to be quite careful. But ultimately, to your challenge, what I would say to those who are thinking about that is, come to us with an actual proposal, detailed, timed, costed, and costings that we can stick to, and I think we could have a really good, robust conversation on that. But it's a good point, and this is something we're up for, but it needs to be done on the basis that we know what we're getting into.
Any more questions from the floor? It's coming.
Hi. You talked a lot about private sector and international investment, and you also talked a lot about military defence forces. I'm just wondering, do those two go together, or do they have to be quite separate things with quite separate outcomes?
Again, this is a public forum. I wouldn't say too much, but we're in a very good and healthy dialogue in terms of how the MOD would engage with the private sector. And again, the commitment from our board is absolutely written in stone. But again, there's always that consideration about how you come to arrangements, and that's not a commercial discussion. But I think in recognition, particularly in the UK, I think there's a recognition that the assets and key pieces of infrastructure are owned by private port groups, and therefore we would use those rather than build separate assets. But again, there is an important consideration there. But I'm very comfortable without saying too much in an open forum that's well recognised on both sides how that relationship can work in a very effective way.
Well, that's interesting because thank you for that question, because it's one less that I've got to ask, because I wrote that down as a question. Where's that balance work? The other questions I had were a bit wider field. Nirvana, who does it well? Who in other countries, geos not limited, who does it well?
So, and again, I feel like I talk about Morocco a lot, but it's worth talking about Morocco very quickly.
That's not the answer I expected.
Right. The reason I say that is because, and again, that's why I talk about the ports in the UK, post-privatisation in the UK in the last 35, 40 years. And just think about what I said about being about 20 years behind in terms of public and private investment, right? In Morocco, for example, they built mega ports, and I can talk about Nador West, I can talk about Tangier Med, I can talk about Dakhla. What they've done, different structure, different ownership, different model, but the point is correct, is that they didn't just build a port, they built the railway, the road infrastructure, the power and grid infrastructure at the same time, and actually future-proofed that. And what we haven't done in the UK, we've slightly let the ports get on with it, which is a good thing, because we will invest and do it in our ways. But if you think about the port estates being that, what we need is the stuff around the port to be right too. It can't just be, we've got the most mega efficient port, and I can look at London Gateway, I can point to Southampton, I can point to Felixstowe, where there's hundreds of millions of pounds investment going to making sure that port estate is efficient as possible. You need the other stuff around it. So Morocco is a great example. Egypt is a great example. Most of the countries in the Scandinavia are in a good example.
Actually, to dive in there, because I was about to say I've been to Morocco quite a few times, so I can imagine why they'd be able to say, take that bit of land, off you go. Most of it's desert.
But what I would say, and actually I was in Bahrain has got a good one on this as well. It's excellent examples in Bahrain. But the key is, and again, I worked in government for a long time, what we've never done is put freight and logistics, which happens to include ports, but I'm talking about the bigger bit here, freight and logistics at the centre of your economic development plan.
Got you.
And interestingly, just this morning, we were talking about growth corridors, and Philip, you might remember this. We were talking about growth corridors in the UK, and again, we're on a small island here, so I think we overcomplicate it in the UK, actually. On a small island, we could do much better and much more, and that's what I'm keen to really make progress on. But economic corridors, there's not actually that many in the UK. Between your airports, your ports, your big logistics parks in the West Midlands, and everything else like that.
Very busy, yeah.
We haven't put that at the centre of your economic development. And if you do that, and there's proven examples around the world, if you put freight and logistics, including ports and airports, at the centre of your economic development as a government, which is why, interestingly, the industrial strategy talk about ports being foundational. We've got to define that. What do we mean by that? Because if you do that, the wall of private money, which I've been talking about,
Comes in. Yeah.
I could say we're going to treble it. I could say we could quadruple it. And I say that with no exaggeration. But we need to have confidence that we do our bit, but what we can't continue to have is where public infrastructure's probably about 20 years behind of what we've done on the private side.
And where there are new projects coming up, I mean, we spoke yesterday about the Northern Powerhouse Rail, etc.
Yep.
Do you get heavily involved, or the local port heavily involved in what that's going to mean? Are we part
Yep.
of the whole infrastructure, etc.?
Well, and that's the journey we've been on, actually. And I think it's worth paying credit to DFT, wider government, DBT, Philip's efforts along the way, National Highways, Network Rail. You know, we're talking about international gateways now in a way that I don't think we have historically, and that
Yeah.
will be considered in the next RIS. It will be considered in the future control periods for rail. It will be considered in the same way for National Grid and
Yeah.
NESO,
Yeah.
as I think about the regional energy strategic plans.
Yep.
I just think that we haven't really thought about ports enough, and that's part of the reason why we're here, to make sure, at least if you're thinking about it, you've
Yeah.
got half a chance.
No, I'm with you. There are a couple other points that were left and right of that. So the first one was, let's say that you get your view about dual usage for the big ports. Is that going to be British troops? Is that NATO? Is there funding from other people that could help build that?
It'll be a combination.
Combination
It'll
of
be
two.
an absolute
Okay.
combination. And again, colleagues talk about, you know, the UK being a lily pad or an aircraft carrier to support efforts into Northern Europe
Right.
as an island protected by water.
Yep.
You know, it's for others to decide how you use that from a military capability and a strategic point. But I think inevitably we will see our ports used on an international basis, because you've got effectively a protected piece of land there as an island that other colleagues and
therefore
friends
use,
can,
yeah.
can therefore use. So I think it'll be a combination.
And the last question about that was, you mentioned it on your penultimate slide about not relying on the national grid and creating your own power. Is that provided privately as well? So the port owner, is that one investing in, whether it's wind, sea, whatever?
It's a live conversation, and I think how we do that is going to be pretty fundamental to your earlier question about the transition. I think for those ports that have got land that's available to use it in a different way, because ultimately we're trying to make sure all of our land is used in a productive way. You're not really going to take up 10% of your asset to then generate and store your own fuel, but if you've got land that you think you can allocate to that, I think we'll see our ports taking on a much bigger role in that sort of
And
space.
most of them on flat lands near the sea, they're not utilised anyway.
But, and every port is different, and that's why when I talk about the 43 ports, they're all so different. But the bit inside the port fence, but actually outside the port fence, they all come up against the same challenges on planning, road connectivity, grid connection, you name it.
Brilliant.
So it's an absolutely fascinating time.
Perfect way to end, I would suggest. And I think a massive round of applause to Gant for his openness and frankness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank
Very
you
nice
so
to meet
much. Likewise. Thank you.